So very often the metaphor of journey is a parable or a joke, and we find that our lives are the punchline. We travel a great distance only to find ourselves where we started. This great realization that whatever the outward journey we're on, the inward journey is forever thus. Wherever you go, there you are. Or we find ourselves on a journey to earn, to prove, to build, to accumulate that which we've already had all along, an arrival at a place that we've always been. T.S. Eliot says, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know that place for the first time." So, we value highly the metaphor of journey. This is how our community statement starts. We value it because, in part, the metaphor allows for this paradox that we're talking about, the journey of both discovering new realities and rediscovering who we already are, where we already are, that which is already most deeply true of us, rather than setting out elsewhere to find it. Whether discovery or rediscovery, it speaks in general of progress, of change, development, the journey of life. We probably use that phrase. And in spirituality, this journey has been historically both literal and metaphorical. First, the pilgrimage as a literal journey, which would indicate sort of an interior spiritual path or experience, but then also the purely metaphorical inner spiritual journey of formation, some sort of personal development. And in all these ways, whether inner, outer, discovery, rediscovery, literal or metaphorical, what is being communicated is clear and powerful. That to stay where we are, who we are, as we are, is not an option. We don't get to choose that. Life, like location, is not static. As much as we may seek and desire stasis, safety, stability, certainty, we are creatures born into a life and a world of change and progress. We're born into a journey, and I would argue we are born to journey. And that, I think, is the deeper truth of journey in the fisherman parable. And if you think about why the humor works, the reason it's so funny is actually because we get it wrong. We wrongly believe that the fisherman could have remained fixed on that beach, fishing his whole life the way he was that morning, unchanged and unchanging. And then it would be silly. It would be stupid to go on this hunt for a career and a business and all of this wealth only to return to that same fishing village. But the reality is, on the journey of life, we don't remain fixed on the beach. That isn't a choice that's offered to us. We either seek out journey or we are swept up by it. I heard that in many of the groups. I think this is why Thomas Merton says journey is the ultimate metaphor. The ultimate metaphor. So I want to work rather quickly tonight sort of through some of these things, and I want to begin at the beginning. How does a journey start? And this is not exhaustive by any means, but I think that the text that we heard from Genesis 12 helps to sort of frame some components of how journey often works regardless of who we are. I think it begins with some sort of what I'll call an unconditional call. And in the case of the text, the Lord said. That's sort of how the call of Abraham begins. And last week I shared some of John Caputo's quotes. He's a philosopher and theologian. He says, God is the name of a call. God does not exist. God insists. So rather than a being on sort of the realm of existing, non-existing, being or non-being, Caputo would say God is the name of a call. That which calls us to bring life and love and hospitality, all these things into being. God calls, God haunts, God insists, so that we bring into existence this kind of life and reality. And the point is, this call is always calling, whether or not we're listening. This is throughout the biblical text, from Abram and Moses and the prophets and Jesus. They hear a call that they can no longer silence. They can't ignore it. And we see this in other religious traditions. The prophets hear some call, and even in secular culture. People speak of how they got where they are in life, their success, the idea, the business, that cause, the move, as if something spoke to them, as if something nagged them or haunted them until they couldn't not hear it anymore, until they couldn't avoid it. And I love that in the text, the Lord says, for a land that I will show you. It's not a land that you get to discover or you get to create or settle or to which you lay claim. This idea that you should go somewhere that I will show you removes and totally eliminates ego. Abram doesn't get to know where he's going, and he doesn't get to be the one to choose where he's going. So after a call comes a Wow, see, you guys are with me. I like it. Yeah. That would have been the ideal opportunity for everyone to say a response, because it was a call, and on the way home, you're going to be like, I totally get what he was doing. There was, right? It's like art imitating life, imitating art or something. But this is where it gets personal. God says, but then there's a to Abram. Now, there is this is one of my favorite stories, and it's actually not in the Bible. It's in what's called the Midrash, which is the rabbinic commentary on the Bible. But the story is, after Abram gets the call, he then goes to work one day in his father's idol shop. So his father sells idols in the ancient Near East. And Abram goes in, and he's working a shift in the idol shop, and an old man comes in, and he wants to buy an idol. And Abram says, how old are you? And he says, I'm 65. He goes, well, why would you buy an idol that's only a day old? Right? And the guy huffs off, and he's like, and then an old woman comes in, she's got some food, and she wants to make a food sacrifice to the idol. And so Abram takes this mallet that's in the hand of one of the idols, smashes all the other idols, and then puts the mallet back in the hand of the biggest idol. And the woman storms off. She's really upset. And his father comes in. He's like, what in the world happened? You've ruined my entire idol shop. And Abram says, oh no, the woman came in to make a food sacrifice, and the idols all argued about who should get the food. And then the big one just smashed them all. And his father, he pauses and he says, no, he looks at him like he's crazy. He's like, no. These are lifeless statues. And Abram says, then why do you bow down and worship them? Drop the mic, right? And the story is the next day he leaves. That's bye, Dad. And the sense is he knew that his dad knew that these were idols, that they were not real, that they were just religious relics. There was no call harbored in these statues. Nothing was speaking to them, but somewhere along the line, Abraham had heard something. He actually heard that universal call, something he'd never heard in the idol shop. We might say God had been calling all along, and Abram was finally listening. And that's really more of the mystical understanding of this call. In fact, contemplation means with a template, as in a template for listening, a tool for listening. And I love this. The word vocation, also it comes from the Latin vocatio, for listening, hearing. So Abram gets his vocation, the journey, the blessing of the whole world, not just from that unconditional universal call, but he gets it from his particular conditioned, located way of listening. He heard that universal call in a very specific way. He had a template for hearing, and that shaped the way that he heard what he heard. And I don't think we can really dispute that that is how it works. Because we have all sorts of religions all around the world listening for this universal call. And they're hearing many different, diverse, often beautiful, and very often destructive things. And then even beyond the world's religions, we have even within the same religion, churches and people who are committed to listening to that same universal call, called by the same name, God, witnessed in the same person, Jesus, revealed in the same text, the Bible, and yet their templates for listening are so different and unique, in particular, that even in the same denominations, they are hearing vastly different things from that same universal call. Not because the call is different, but because the contemplation, that template for listening, is different. The vocation has been formed differently in different groups of people. And so our hope is that the particular expression of our community, what is articulated in our community statement, and the way that that forms our practices, creates a specific kind of template for the way we listen and hear that call, a vocation that forms our hearing, forms the way we understand words like God, and the way we listen together to that unconditional universal call. Now, so far, this is all well and good. We can listen, we can learn to listen, we can shape our lives to hear and to respond, but then it begins to cost us something, and we encounter what my friend and one of my professors, very delicately, I guess, calls unsettling movement. In collective terms, I think this is like the oh moment, right? I said yes to the job. I said yes to the date, to the trip. I accepted the offer. I jumped. I took the risk. I signed the paper. I accepted the terms. I wrote the check. There's that moment where we're actually unsettled. We're dislocated. We have to go somewhere else. And ideally, it's got a couple parts. We leave and maybe we're going somewhere, but it's more unsettling if you're just leaving. But in all honesty, even if you have a destination in mind, the reality is nothing is guaranteed. So you may think you're going there. You're not necessarily. Martin Buber says, all journeys have secret destinations of which the traveler is unaware. If you've ever been on a road trip, you know that that's just the truth. So really, the thing is this. You're not moving from where you are to where you think you're going. And I know you think you are. But you're actually going from where you are to wherever your foot lands next. And then wherever it lands after that. The next step, the next moment, the next day, the next season. And I love Merton's prayer. I have no idea where I'm going. I think that's one of the greatest prayers of all time. And the thing is, it sounds terrifying, but it's not just terror. I love this. I saw it on Facebook maybe like 10 days ago. I do not have the slightest clue what I'm doing. That's the adventure. I stopped worrying about it. That's the beauty. That's huge. So it's not just terrifying. There's something life-giving about this. And this is the truth from the prophet Louis C.K. He says, you'll be fine. Feeling unsure and lost is a part of your path. Don't avoid it. See what those feelings are showing you and use it. Take a deep breath. You'll be okay, even if you don't feel okay all the time. Some of us, not me, but some of us could paste that to our mirror probably and do okay. So like in Abram's story, it wasn't leave your country, leave your people, leave your father, which by the way, that made up tribal identity, familial identity, and ancient Near Eastern security. So he basically left everything he knew, huge risk, leave, but the call wasn't go 3 blocks down, take a right, the land will be 100 yards down on your left. No, it's just leave. Leave and go. And I'll show you, I swear. But what happens when you get like hundreds of miles out and all of a sudden you're not hearing anymore? It's like, oh, uh-oh. So Thomas Merton says the journey always includes leaving for. But again, remember, he's the one who says, I have no idea where I'm going. So I think maybe it's enough to be leaving certainty for trust, to be leaving safety for vulnerability, to be leaving comfort for risk, to be leaving walled in for wide open, right? Leaving for doesn't always mean we know that we're leaving this and we know exactly where we're going to arrive. We just know we're leaving this and we're leaving it for something else. Something else. We're leaving our known location for an unknown journey. So Richard Rohr does some amazing work on development, and I want to apply it to this metaphor of journey. If we're not willing to journey through our fears, through these anxieties, we'll never learn and we'll never grow. Because we always move from one step, one location, to a step or a location that we can't entirely see or understand. And so he says, every step of the spiritual journey is taken in semi-darkness by the light of faith. And the greatest barrier to the next step of the journey is our sense of comfort and control in the one we're at now. And again, back on the beach, we believe that we can actually stay there, right? It can just stay like this. So our first response to someone calling us to leave comfort, control, certainty, and stasis, even if they're inviting us to leave that for the risk of goodness, of elevated consciousness, of a full and meaningful life, it's still experienced to us as a threat. It's still experienced as increased anxiety because we don't say, isn't this great? I'm going to leave what I know for what I don't. I'm going to leave what's comfortable for what is scary. I feel terribly insecure. We don't say that. Instead, we recoil. And if we're honest with ourselves, we don't want to go there. We don't want to go into that which we don't know. And Rohr does this brilliant bit where he points out that the edges of medieval maps would frequently have penciled on the far edges, areas that hadn't been charted yet, here be dragons. You see sort of the far, right? And that basically meant we don't know what's there, we're scared of it, right? Don't go there, like it could be awesome, but it also could kill you. So here be dragons. And he says, we confront the dragons every time we reach the edge of our comfort level, the edge of what we know, when we're confronted with departing into the unknown, embarking into the vulnerability of journey. And we have to discover a spirituality that reminds us that dragons aren't out there, that the dragons we fear are in here, in our comfort level, in our sense of certainty, in our fear of the unknown. very often our fear of the other. And so to say we value highly the metaphor of journey, I think means in some sense we are individuals. We're a community of people who have heard some kind of a universal call, right? And we could spend the next 3 years talking about exactly what we mean by that. And then we're being and becoming intentional about shaping our lives, our templates for the way that we listen. Some kind of call. We listen as a community, the shape of our vocation in order that we can hear that call in a particular way. And then we're also a group of people who are willing to leave, to take the next step, to keep changing, to progress and make progress. Even though, and here's the important part, even though we're not certain, even though we don't have everything figured out, even though, as Merton prays, we have no idea where we're going. So, what time is it? 6:10. Okay. I'm going to keep going. And I'll do this quick, but I think it's important. So I think that's how it begins, right? And tonight is the beginning of the community statement thing, so I think it was important to kind of frame that. But what might it feel like after we've begun? And many of us kind of know this because we've been on sort of an intentional spiritual journey for some time. And I want to paint this with broad brushstrokes because I think the specifics are actually named pretty well in the community statement. We'll do that for the next 7 weeks. But I think the overarching answer is actually pretty obvious, and I love this. It's beautiful. It's the answer that Mother Teresa gives when she's asked how she started this famous order of nuns that served the poor in Calcutta, right? And so what does it look like? How does it feel? How does journey happen? Mother Teresa asked, how did she form this order of nuns in Calcutta? Little by little. That was her response. Isn't that brilliant? How did you do this world-changing work? Little by little. That's what it feels like. That's what it looks like. That's how progress happens. Now, that being said, within a lifetime of little by little, I do think that there are some things that are important in terms of a framework that we can sort of read the metaphor of journey over our lives. The first one, I think, is pace. You've probably heard it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. How many of you have ever heard that, right? And people are like, man, don't rush so much. Like, take your time. I actually disagree because they're both still running, which is awful. As a former, thank you, Mayhill. Any other running haters, right? I just hate it because I can't do it anymore. As a longtime endurance athlete, I can tell you there are moments in every marathon, in every Ironman triathlon, where even if you're running at a really slow marathon pace, it still feels like you're sprinting. It is all out. And you can't sustainably run a marathon every day. I actually love the pace that's mentioned in the text, walking. Because you can walk every day. You can, right? It's about movement. It's not about mileage. One foot in front of the other. It's about progress rather than speed. And one of the things that I love and I hope is clear in the community statement, and actually more so just in the vibe of Collective, who we are, is that there isn't this pressure. There's not this rush, this unspoken hurry to get somewhere. I think valuing highly the metaphor of journey means that we are walking together. We're not valuing the illusion of some destination, so we don't need to sprint. We don't even need to run. We need to be together. We need to walk. I was thinking about it this week. It's almost impossible to talk and engage and connect with another human being when you're sprinting. Trust me, I've tried. But walking is a talking pace. You can know someone. You can share deeply. You can learn about someone's life walking. And so I think valuing the metaphor of journey means we value the people with us more than some frenzied rush to get somewhere. So pace, and then there's rest. The text says they camped, which could include a bunch of things, and we could go off into tons of tangents. But the reality is just the fact that they stopped is important. And we're going to do a bunch of stuff this summer on rest and Sabbath and the rhythms of life. But this is huge, simply because a journey is not sustainable without rest. You have to rest. You have to recover, or you can't keep doing it. And not only is rest built into our liturgy, what we do every week, we sit in silence, we breathe. And part of the reason we do that is because for many of you, this is the only time in your entire week where we force you not to do anything. Right? There's nothing to learn. There's nothing to accumulate. There's nothing to achieve. We simply sit and be. We rest. We release thoughts. We empty our minds. We just sit. But I also think, and I hope, in large part, this is what we are and what we do regularly on Sunday night. And I don't think this is actually the bulk of your spiritual journey or mine. I think that happens in our day-to-day lives, in our work and with our families and the causes and the ways that we serve and the way we interact with our neighbors and our friends. We often say Sunday night or the sermon is the first word, but the journey and the formation, that happens in the words in the week that follows. It's not all in here. It's everything that happens in your life. And so I think a lot of what we're doing when we get together is learning to rest together, to celebrate the steps that we've come in that week or in that season, to refresh ourselves, to be inspired, to be supported, relationships that sustain us and encourage us. So pace and rest, and then finally ritual. And often when people hear ritual, I think they think, and I know I was this way for a long time, organized religion, calcified institution, and the assumption is carried with it dead ritual, right? Ritual for ritual's sake, kind of just going through the motions. And I think it's important to name it because it's an issue, right? That's what many folks have left, or what many folks have been kicked out of. That kind of a religious experience, which does bring up a good point. We talked about this at Occupy Trilogy this week. Not all people are on a journey initially by choice. Many are refugees from religion, from churches, from unsafe people, right? The LGBTQ community, so many minorities, people who have been pushed to the margins. And many who did choose to leave, they chose to embark on that journey, they did so for what seemed to be lack of any other choice. Right? Maybe they weren't actually kicked out, but they also didn't see any future staying in whatever group they were in. And so one of the rituals that accompanies journey is the ritual, and many of you know this. This is something that Stacy and I go back and forth on all the time when a trip is coming up, the ritual of packing. Or in this case, for many of us, unpacking baggage. Because part of where many of us have arrived is the realization that we don't need any more beliefs. We don't need any more theology. We don't need any more answers. We don't need any more products. We don't need any more Bible studies. We don't need any more Bible references. And we don't need anyone placing any more religious demands on us. We've realized, in fact, what we need to do is unpack. We need to unlearn. We need to cleanse ourselves of so much that we've amassed or had heaped on us through the process of journeying to where we are now. And so maybe we need to simplify. God is love. Church is a school of love. Love is ultimately what is harbored in the name of God. The church is ultimately where we learn to practice this together. And the reality is we can't begin to pack for whatever it is that's next until we unburden ourselves of all of that stuff that we've been carrying, whether that's beliefs or theologies or assumptions or interpretations or religious judgment or the relationships we have with our families and what they think about us. There's all sorts of stuff. And so maybe the first ritual is just sort of looking at what's in our bag, right? What are we going to carry with us as we set out again? Are we carrying it intentionally, or do we just happen to be pulling like 8 or 10 suitcases that we haven't really thought about in a while? Meister Eckhart is a famous mystic. He says, the spiritual life is not one of addition, but subtraction. You guys don't need any more stuff, right? And that's for me. This is what I do for a living, is trying to convince you to keep listening to me. I'm telling you, you don't need to. You're fine. You're totally fine. You don't need any more, right? Really, what you probably need is less. But over time, as has happened for many of us, if we can get to a place of neutral or even a place of appreciation for ritual, again, for liturgy, the work of the people, a shared communal life, we're reminded how important this actually is. Repetition, especially if we don't know where we're going and we don't know who we're becoming. Because ritual builds a powerful sense of belonging. We share these rituals together. These help us make us us. We practice ways of journeying together, ways of being together, ways of living together. And part of what's so life-giving about doing this in a community is that ritual removes some of the pressure of recurring choices. This is what I mean. In cycling, there's something called the draft effect that allows an exhausted rider who cannot sustain a particular pace to tuck in behind a group of riders and draft off their pace. And it greatly lightens the load. It almost pulls the rider in back behind this big group. And what that does is it removes the pressure either to match an unsustainable pace in order to continue or to drop that group entirely. And instead, the rider can draft because of the way the group has chosen to ride. Because of the shape of that community, it enables people to come in who can't sustain a pace, but also who don't need to be dropped. And they find the group can do more working together than they ever could, one rider at a time. I've actually seen this the last couple of years, been fascinated by this too, in the CrossFit movement, right? Because you have the same things. They're the same movements and the same workouts and the same effort levels in which a single person on their own probably would not last very long. And yet when they're held together by this deep communal bond, it's fascinating how these groups come together and do this for long periods of time and the results that they can achieve. You would never do it one person at a time. But when it's done in a community, it changes the dynamic entirely. I think ritual, I think shared practice, liturgy, these consistent things, the way people can count on each other, ritual is like drafting. It's the shape of a community that draws people together to do more than they could on their own. And I'll tell you, because many of you probably don't know this, there have been weeks and there have been entire seasons in my life in the last 4 years where I've been drafting off you, and you probably haven't noticed it. Right? It wasn't any additional effort for you. But especially like in this last season where I was serving as a hospice chaplain, there were times where I would not have made it if it hadn't been for the way that you all pulled me. And I know that's weird because usually the dynamic is like the leader has to do everything, right? And pull everyone along. It's the opposite. You all have pulled me. And this is why altars are so important in the text. You keep seeing Abraham built an altar, and then he built an altar, and then he built an altar. They are reminders of a shared experience. They're markers that remind them that they are making progress. They're pillars of gratitude for the fact that they still hear the call. Right? They're on this journey together and they're all still listening, and they will leave again as a community. So we value highly the metaphor of journey. We hear a call, we respond, we set out. We journey at a pace that values people and progress, not arrival. We rest because we value sustainability. And we practice ritual because it shapes us. It reminds us who we are and how we are progressing together as a community, which brings us back to this altar, to our ritual, to this table that's set every week, not mindlessly, it's not robotically. We don't set it like Ronco rotisserie, right? Set it and forget it. We do this with deep intention. We do this with reflection. We do this with awareness. And this is a table that speaks to us of the metaphor of journey, because as we come each week, we are never exactly the same community. I mean, if you looked at who was in the room last week compared to who's in the room this week, totally different. But at the same time, you are not the same person as you were last week. We are a week further along this path. And sure, that's a week of additional bumps and bruises and wounds and worries, but it's also a week of additional gifts and graces. Another week of love, another week of lovely developments. And so we build our altar, we set our table to remember that we have come from somewhere, right? We look at our past. We engage this ritual to be present in this moment right now, and to put an eye on the compass of our hearts and on the horizon of wherever it is that we're going next. When Jesus is with his friends and he breaks bread, when he shares the cup, he's helping them to remember a famous journey, the beginning of the Exodus, the Passover meal. That's what they're celebrating. So he's helping them to remember. There's this famous journey, but I think he's also inviting them to be deeply present with him in that moment. I mean, how much more present can you get? He says, "This is my body. This is my blood. Be present with me here now." And then also pointing them to the future. He says, as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, he assumes they'll keep doing this. And each time they do it, they grow closer, more and more alive. And so we set this table, we ritualize our journey to mark another season, to mark another week on this path of love together, becoming who we are together. The people have been gathered, the story has been told, the bread has been broken. This table is set, it is open for us tonight and for all people, and no one will ever be turned away. When you're ready, feel free to come and grab a piece of the bread and dip it in the cup.